there is trans-kingdom communication between our microbiome and our cells. The type of gut bacteria that you have determines whether you're going to be fat or thin, no matter how many calories you actually eat. We now know that almost everyone who has low energy, by definition, has a leaky gut. We'll probably eventually learn that it may be more important than the bacterial microbiome. There's even a mycobiome, which are the fungi that live within us, and the molds. But the virome is really fascinating. And this is kind of, we're talking about drug companies now coming out with vaccines for COVID-19, but a lot of people don't know that Eli Lilly, which is one of our major drug companies out of Indianapolis, got its start by making what are called bacteriophages. And bacteriophages are viruses that infect bacteria. And they actually got their start long before the days of antibiotics. It was learned that viruses could be used to attack and kill bacteria or manipulate bacteria. And what's fascinating about the virome is that viruses can easily infect bacteria, but they can transfer genetic information from one bacteria to another bacteria and completely change almost instantaneously how a bacteria behaves. And what we're going to learn, and I think what we are learning, is this microbiome, I call it the holobiome. It's just an incredible ecosystem where one organism is dependent on what another organism is bringing to the table. There's to decipher the language that's happening in this intense rainforest, this ecology within us. You have to have supercomputer power to figure out what one little piece of virus might be doing to one bacteria, which then spreads to, billions of bacterial colonies within our gut in a matter of hours.
So one of the things that we know now, that you can fit dozens, hundreds of virus particles into a single bacteria cell. Just the size and scope of it is so remarkable. But just to think about the ability for them to transfer data, that's what viruses are really, really good at. That's what they do in nature. And they're a part of us. It's kind of how we're wired up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, you're right. This is data transfer. And I've, tried to get people to imagine our microbiome, which includes our virome, as a cloud computer. And that our genes, we got a lousy set of genes. I mean, believe it or not, corn has more genes than you and I, which is it makes us rather humble. And we don't even have the most genes of any animal. A sand flea has more genes than you or I. And so it turns out that 99% of all the genes that are within us, you and I, are actually non-human genes. And the information processing that these genes are capable of and the exchange of information is so vast, because these bacteria replicate instantaneously. And so you take a little virus, put a couple of new pieces of information into a bacteria, which is then able to replicate and churn out billions, trillions of copies within a few hours. And then you can completely change the information that then can be sent on back to us. And I actually talk a lot about that in the upcoming book, The Energy Paradox. We now know that there is trans-kingdom communication between our microbiome and our cells. And the language of how that's communicated has been discovered. And I like to think back in World War II, one of the major changes that changed the course of the war was the breaking of the German code, the Enigma code. And when that code was finally broken, deciphered, the Allies finally figured out how Germany was talking to all the troops, to the planes. And it's the same thing. We've suspected for actually about 15 years that somehow bacteria and viruses were talking to our mitochondria, were talking to our brain, talking to our heart, but we didn't know the language. And thanks to some Nobel Prize winning work, that language was discovered. And but a lot of the energy paradox is we now know that language. So our cloud computer is actually contained inside of us. So we upload, we have so little processing power in our genetic material that we've basically uploaded most of our, lack of a better word, thinking to our cloud, which is an internal cloud of bacteria and viruses, to do the processing for us.
In this conversation about the human genome, I think this is really, really important for us to understand. And I've been talking about this for months now. But when they mapped out, like you said, our number of genes pale in comparison, even to other mammals, and not just other mammals, like you said, fruit flies.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, the sand flea. So, you and I are walking on the beach and we're stepping on these little almost microscopic creatures. They got more genes than you and me.
It's nuts. Corn, et cetera, et cetera. But when the human genome was mapped out, they thought they'd find this vast array. But yet, I think it was maybe somewhere in the ballpark of 25,000.
22, 21.
And so what, of course, other factors that they discovered was that about 8% of the human genome was viruses, endogenous retroviruses. We're actually part virus ourselves.
Yep.
What the hell? Why are we not talking about this?
Well, again, we haven't discovered what that part of our genome encodes. We used to call it dark, the dark part of our genome, that it was nonsense. And it was nonsense because we didn't know what that language was. Mm-hmm. And as we're beginning to realize that even what we think is dark genes that we don't know what they do, it's just because we haven't deciphered the language of what that encodes. And just like we had no idea that bacteria talk to us, it's like, oh, come on. These little one-cell creatures are, sending us messages. It's like, do.
It's some freaky stuff.
Yeah.
But it's so fascinating, too. And it's just where we are right now. And even in my first book, Sleep Smarter, Caltech researchers found that specific cells in the gut were communicating with, so the bacteria is communicating with cells that create our sleep-related hormones and neurotransmitters, but the language wasn't understood yet, but they knew it was happening.
Right.
Now we're going to understand more about the language. That's really, really cool. So being that we are ourselves part virus, and there's a symbiotic relationship also that we have with viruses that's overlooked. What we're attempting to do right now, which we try to do with bacteria, is kill all the stuff. Let's kill the small things. We finally discovered what creates disease in humans. Is our intention a little bit skewed? Is it a little bit off course when we're trying to kill the different viruses and to kill bacteria?
I think that's a great question. And it actually brings to the forefront, there was back in the days when bacteria were first discovered, there were two really great opposing gentlemen in France, Beauchamp and Pasteur. And so Beauchamp was actually an accomplished academician and was really one of the premier bacteriologists and virologists of his day. And Pasteur, most people don't know, Pasteur was not a physician. But Pasteur was actually a great communicator. He was what we'd use now, mediagenic. And Pasteur became famous because he figured out that wine was going bad because of bacterial contamination. Now, needless to say, if you're in France and you figure out that a bacteria might be the cause of ruining a wine crop, then you'd probably be a popular guy. And in fact, the King of France appointed him as, the head guy to oversee all science in terms of bacteriology. So what Pasteur said was bacteria are, the cause of this problem, and we need to eradicate bacteria, and that'll solve the problem. And Beauchamp said, no. You're all wrong about this. Bacteria and viruses and yeasts and molds actually coexist in a community. And the French, the word terroir is this, where you find yourself, the land. There's a terroir in winemaking of the soil, the amount of water, the viruses and bacteria and fungi on the roots, and the terroir makes the wine. So Beauchamp, throughout his career, kept saying, bacteria is just a tiny piece of this puzzle. And if the bacteria are in the right mixture with the viruses and the molds, then everything's fine. And Pasteur, because he was very mediagenic, said, no, it's the bacteria. And you're right, we have to kill the bacteria. And the word pasteurization was basically sterilize the milk or whatever. And so that whole science of killing bacteria, because they were somehow evil, really continued to really the present day. But what's kind of fun is they were arch rivals, and Beauchamp kind of fell from favor. But it is said, and it's in several books, that on Pasteur's deathbed, he called Beauchamp to his side, and he said, you're correct, it is the terroir. So,
Wow.
Yeah. So I think, the point of all this is, and what we've learned from how we think we know the microbiome so far, is that it is the terroir. That, I'll give you an example. I see a large number of female patients who tell me that they suffer from candida, yeast infection, and an overgrowth of yeast. And I've yet, in 20 years, never had to give any of these patients who supposedly have candida an antifungal drug. All we have to do is don't give candida what it likes to eat, which is sugar, and in particular fruit sugar, and it doesn't have anything to live on, and everything else, the balance restores. So actually, I spend my career restoring terroir. That's all I do.
This is why I'm so grateful to talk with you, because of that perspective. The body is, of course, just like everything in nature, always trying to find balance. But so often in our system, we try to attack the symptom instead of removing the cause. Let's remove the thing so things can get back into balance. It's really a simple principle. It's often a lot less expensive to do, So thank you so much for bringing that point up. And also, one of the things that I'm concerned about right now is the training that our bacteria get, that our microbiome, that our holobiome is able to receive, because it's sort of like, I liken it to like a little light workout when you interact with other people for your immune system every day. And suddenly, and I just get a red flag that goes up when anything that we do goes outside of what our genes expect us to do. And so when we are suddenly separating from other people and isolating, I wonder what that does for the health of our holobiome, for our virome, for our microbiome that actually keeps us protected. Do you have any insight on that? Because I'm definitely very, very curious about this.
Well, I like the expression holobiome, and for folks who are saying what the heck is a holobiome, we have species of bacteria and viruses and molds in any orifice on our skin. When we have it in our mouth, we have it in our nose, we have it in our ears. Ladies, you have it in your vagina, your breast ducts. So wherever we exchange with the outside world, we have it. We even have a cloud of viruses and bacteria that are circulating around us, kind of like Pigpen in the Peanuts cartoon.
Yeah.
And this is actually a very real thing. And there's some really kind of fun research that suggests the idea of a personal space that we have, don't get too close to me, is your holobiome interacting with the holobiome of that person next to you. And there's a lot of consideration, particularly in cultures unlike America, where the idea of kissing on the cheek or hugging on both cheeks is exchanging that holobiome. In fact, there's really fun stuff that our oral microbiome decides compatibility with your mate or with whomever you're with at that particular time, because actually deep kissing is universal in all human cultures. And the theory is, and I think it's more than a theory, that our bacteria, our microbiome, our holobiome is deciding whether this mix is a good mix. And now that we know that these guys communicate with our brain, that they're sentient human beings, that maybe, so go out and kiss some people. But yeah, so, it's a fine line. And I've urged people to realize that, again, we'll talk about World War II. Can you imagine if the British sat in their bunkers for 5 years, being bombed every night, and just waited for the Manhattan Project, the atom bomb, our vaccine, and didn't arm themselves, fortify themselves, and go out and meet the enemy head on, armed. The same thing, you wouldn't send troops into battle unarmed. That would be a slaughter, but you would arm yourself. And what we've neglected, I think, with the COVID-19 is we know full well how to arm ourselves against viruses. We know very well how to do that. There are now 17 separate studies showing the higher your vitamin D level, the safer you are from COVID. And if you get COVID, it will be a mild illness. 17 different studies now. Yeah. And one of the sad things about the Black and brown community is, I'm sorry, you guys in general don't have much vitamin D because you don't have the ability to absorb it very well. And you look at New York City, there was a study a few years ago looking at population of Queens, and only 10% of them had a vitamin D level above 30, and 10% of the population. And all of my patients, I'm running their vitamin D levels above 100. And I won't let them, out of my sight until I get their vitamin D levels above 100. And I mean, why aren't we, preaching? My gosh, folks, for $5, go get a vitamin D level, and keep taking your vitamin D level, and keep taking your vitamin D. It'll fortify you. The other thing that's important, we've known from day one that people with pre-existing conditions are the people who are going to get COVID. Well, start naming the pre-existing conditions. So it's obesity, it's diabetes, it's pre-diabetes, it's hypertension, it's heart disease. Well, all of those are actually from leaky gut. Hippocrates 2,500 years ago said all disease begins in the gut. And if we, said, wait a minute, these people are set up for COVID because they have leaky gut. Why don't we go and restore these guys' gut? Why don't we get gut diversity? Why don't we change the foods they're eating? And again, and this is important for your new book, in World War II, rationing was done in many countries, United States, Great Britain, Norway, Denmark. And we know the effect of rationing. And rationing was, we rationed sugar and flour. And 40% of all the food eaten in the United States in World War II was from home victory gardens. 40% of all the food was grown at home. And you look at the incidence of diabetes, you look at the incidence of heart disease, you look at the incidence of death during World War II, and in those 5 years, all of these things dramatically plummeted. In fact, there were diabetes clinics in Norway and Denmark that closed because there were no more diabetics to take care of during the war. And so if we don't, if we just took some steps to arm ourselves, then you're right. We're surrounded by viruses 24 hours a day. We're surrounded by bacteria 24 hours a day. And they're not necessarily our enemy. They're looking for chinks in the armor. And if we don't give them the chinks, they're not going to get a toehold. And if they do get a toehold, then our immune system, if we fortify it, it was designed to handle what comes at us. My critics say, well, the Adventists eat a lot of soy. Believe it or not, they eat pressurized and high heat treated soy, which I talk about in all my books is the way to get lectin content down. But the interesting thing about the Adventists, and it's a point I make in the plant paradox, but also in the longevity paradox. One of my good friends, Gary Frazier, who's a cardiologist, whose life's work at Loma Linda has been tracing the longevity of the Adventists. And it's interesting, the vegan Adventists live the longest of all the very long-lived Adventists. And next comes the vegetarians who don't eat eggs and cheese. Next come the vegetarians that eat eggs and cheese. And then come the Adventists who cheat. And there's a number of cheating Adventists, and they eat fish or chicken. And so he's revealed this through multiple studies. I think it's now 6 published studies. And the vegan Adventists have the best longevity, which is fascinating. And I think there's a reason behind that, and I talk a lot about that in the longevity paradox.
Yeah, you sure do. And you also cover some of the other blue zones and talk about how their diets look very different. On the other side, some of them are not vegans at all. And so those are these small, minute things that are consistent. And I want to start with kind of diving in and look at some of these consistent things. And one of those things you start with is these non-human ancient genes being one of the kind of root sources of longevity and where we need to really be looking. So can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, interestingly enough, 11 years ago, I wrote my first book called Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution. And the subtitle was Turn Off the Genes That Are Killing You. And back in those days, we didn't know really anything about the microbiome, the bugs that live in us and on us. And I thought that it was actually our human genes that were controlling our fate. Fast forward for this book, and the reason that book was called Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution is because my thoughts have evolved. And quite frankly, if you're spouting the same thing you said 10 years ago, I probably don't want to listen to you
Right.
because
It's probably broken.
it's guess what? Time marches on and research marches on. So the fascinating thing is that our genes really have very little to do with what's going to happen to us. Huge NIH study recently published that you're aware of showed that of everything that's going to happen to us in longevity, in diseases, our genes have only about 8% effect on what's going to happen to you or me. So that means 92% of the genes that are going to have an effect on you aren't yours or mine, they're actually our microbiome. So we have trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of bacteria, viruses, worms, protozoa in us and on us. And even though they have fewer genes per little bacteria than you and me, because there's so many of them, the microbiome actually has well over 260 times more genetic material than you and me. And what's really cool, I learned this from a professor of microbiology in Paris a few years ago. And he thought, and I actually subscribe to his theory, that because what this huge resource of, if you will, computing power of genetic material that lives in our microbiome, that reproduces constantly, he believed, and I back him up, that we uploaded most of our information processing, just like we upload our information processing to the cloud, we uploaded or downloaded to our bacterial cloud because they've got more computing power. And it sounds kind of far out there, do. But I think he's right, because we now know that the bacteria within us actually control our fate. And it's really hard for a smart person to say, oh, come on now, these little one-cell organisms are going to control me. But in fact, it's actually true, because this is their home. And I like to tell people and get people to understand that we're basically a condominium for bugs. And this is their home. And they're actually living in us at our request. And if we keep their home good, they'll keep us well. Because, quite frankly, if we're doing well, they'll have a great home the rest of their lives. And we'll probably get into this, but the amazing thing is you can take people who are 105 years old, very much like Edith Murray, and who are doing well, and look at their microbiome, which has been done, and compare that to the microbiome of 30-year-olds. And the 30-year-olds who are doing well will have the same microbiome as the 105-year-olds that are doing well. And it turns out most people, if they get to that age, have to have a youthful microbiome, or they're never going to get there.
So fascinating. And you talk about some of the studies that found that as folks are progressing nowadays, the average person, some of these species of bacteria, viruses, they're going extinct or becoming endangered in their microbiome. You don't see the same kind of cascade that you would see in somebody who's actually living a long time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's this, normally we have this incredible rainforest of an ecology in our gut. And this rainforest, in a rainforest, maybe there's, 10,000 different species of plants and critters and bugs, and every one of them is dependent on the other.
Right.
So we have an intense rainforest of bugs in our gut. And it turns out that diversity the same thing that makes a rainforest has to exist in our gut. And without that diversity, we're not going to make it very long. And what's happened, as you know, is that we've pretty much thrown napalm on our rainforest almost every day by the things we eat, the way our animals have been fed, the use of antibiotics. We could go on, glyphosate, Roundup. And so it's no wonder that we may be living chronologically older, but in fact, as you started the show, our health span is actually decreasing dramatically. The number of good years we have is going down and down and down. In fact, my generation, the baby boomers, are sicker on far more medications than our parents were at the same time period. And that's actually scary because baby boomers, we figured we were going to live forever. And we're sicker than our supposed very sick parents.
Yeah. Man, this is so fascinating. And we had this idea like, corn has like 30,000 genes. These fruit flies have like 20,000. For sure, humans, we have like 100,000 genes at least or something. We're so complex and dynamic. And then the research is done, and we have like maybe 25,000 genes collectively.
20,000.
Right?
Yeah.
Insane. First of all, we know that about 2/3 of those genes we can influence, like right off the bat with our lifestyle, right?
Correct.
These epigenetic influences.
Correct.
But my question is, what makes us so different? What makes us so diverse versus corn, which you would think, doesn't have as much genetic information as we do?
Yeah, I mean, corn literally has far more genes than human beings. They have about 30,000 genes. And even the water flea, Daphnia, has more genes than humans. So we actually are really fairly poorly equipped with genes. But what's fascinating is we've traded our lack of genes in exchange for huge amounts of genes in our microbiome. And there's even one paper that I cite, which is fascinating. You can actually trace now from stool sample DNA of bacteria the immediate time when humans split off from the lines of great apes that became chimps and gorillas. And it was actually the change in the microbiome that actually determined that you and I are humans and not, other great apes. And you can actually now, because the DNA is still intact in stools that have been fossilized, you can actually now detect that we're different because our microbiome changed. And that is what made us unique.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's like, what?
So I want to talk about some of the roles that they play for us, because one of the things, for example, which I had no idea about for many years, they make vitamins and minerals in us for us. And there's other kind of symbiotic things they do. So let's talk some about that.
Yeah, that's true. Without really your microbiome, a lot of the vitamins that we take for granted would never be absorbed or even manufactured in the first place. But what's really fascinating is we knew for many years that the gut was the source of a lot of important hormones that affect our brain, our mood, serotonin, for instance, melatonin, for instance. And we thought for years that this was produced by cells lining the gut, but we're now beginning to realize that these actual hormones are produced by our gut microbiome. And you've got to have the right mixture of bugs to actually transform basic building blocks into, for instance, serotonin, which is the feel-good hormone. So if you've got bad bugs or gang members living there, they have no interest or ability to make these hormones. So it's no wonder that if you've got a bunch of gang members in your gut rather than what I call gut buddies, that your angry, that you're moody, that you're anxious, because that's actually a reflection of this, really bad neighborhood that's living in you. And the other amazing thing is that they can actually control your food appetite. They can control what foods you seek out. And the gang members actually tell you to want simple sugars and saturated fats. That's what they live on. They actually can't live on complex carbohydrates, on resistant starches. The gut buddies love those, but the gang members can't live. So the amazing thing is, even obese people don't realize, that I talk about in the book, that the type of gut bacteria that you have determines whether you're going to be fat or thin, no matter how many calories you actually eat. There's now really cool research that bacteria that live in the small intestine. Now, most people aren't aware that most of the gut microbiome research is done on colon bacteria, the stuff that lives in your large intestine. But years ago, I got focused on the small intestine as kind of the forgotten area, because most of the food nutrients that we absorb come out of the small intestine. And now some really groundbreaking research has shown that depending on the bacteria you have in your small intestine, bacteria are capable of extracting more calories from the food you eat and putting it into you if they're bad bugs. If they don't exist, those calories don't go into you. So the old idea of calorie in, calorie out is so flawed because it never took into account what the bacteria were doing with those calories. And as I talk about in the plant paradox, and again in the longevity paradox, you can actually do fecal transplants of fat bacteria into skinny mice. And there's one example of a skinny woman that I talk about in the plant paradox who got a fecal transplant from a cousin who was overweight, and she was a skinny marathoner. And this woman gained 30 pounds without changing her diet, because now all of a sudden she had bacteria that were capable of extracting more calories and putting it into her without changing her lifestyle, just changing bacteria.
Again, blowing my mind out of my head. It's just so crazy, like, of course, I went to a traditional university, and this was a thing that was drilled into us. If you want your patients to lose weight, have them to basically burn more than they're taking in, end of story.
Yep.
And it just simply is not like that. So many people have suffered and struggled doing that same thing and not understanding what's at the core of this conversation. Another piece with the microbiome and these gut buddies is they're like kind of a border patrol in the first place, right? Of what is getting into your system. Can you talk more about that?
Our microbiome has evolved over millennia to, number one, get used to the foods we eat. And there's always a tension between the creatures that we eat and us. So for instance, plants, believe it or not, don't want to be eaten. They have a life, and they want themselves to survive, and they want their seeds to survive. Just, basic evolutionary principles. So they have a very impressive defense system against being eaten, and that includes lectins, my favorite subject, and all sorts of saponins, for instance, and anti-nutrients. On the other hand, so they've got a very good defensive system. On the other hand, we have our own evolution of handling these poisons. And really, one of the first things we have is mucus. And we'll talk about mucus in a little bit, because mucus is incredibly important for longevity. But we have our gut microbiome, and they have evolved to eat a lot of the things that are potentially dangerous to us. For instance, there is a gluten-eating bacteria that actually loves gluten. And it's unfortunate for so many people who think they're gluten intolerant and they stop eating gluten. Their gluten-eating bugs have nothing to eat, and they basically leave. So then, by accident or on purpose, they re-expose themselves to gluten, which they would have had a defense for because of their microbiome. But now those guys left, and then wham, they go, oh yeah, it's absolutely true I react to gluten because look what happened when I ate it. But it's because their microbiome left that handled the gluten. Now, that's not to say gluten intolerance doesn't exist and celiac doesn't exist. I take care of a huge number of people who have celiac disease. But the important things that people with celiac disease should know, and the reason I've become, I guess, so popular in my clinics, is the vast majority of people I see with gluten intolerance or celiac or autoimmune disease have already gone gluten-free. And they're better, but they're not all the way better. And that's been proven in human trials with a gluten-free diet with intestinal biopsies. Intestinal biopsy is the gold standard for diagnosing celiac disease. So you take over 200 people, put them on a gluten-free diet, supervised gluten-free diet for 16 months. Over 70% of those people on a gluten-free diet, at the end of 16 months, a new intestinal biopsy still shows they have celiac disease. Why? Because the vast majority of gluten-free foods are full of other lectins. For instance, corn is one of the huge mischief makers. In my patient population, about 90% of people who are gluten intolerant cannot tolerate corn. They cross-react to the proteins in corn, the lectins in corn. Same as gluten.
Yeah.
And yet so much of gluten-free food is corn-based.
Wow. And people are just not thinking about that yet. This is one study direct from your book. This was published in Nature, the journal Nature. The makeup of an individual's gut bacteria was a better predictor of many health outcomes, including blood glucose level and obesity. These things were better predictors than their genetics. And in other words, you have a better chance of sharing the same health conditions as your roommate or your spouse than your biological parents. And that's not because of luck or coincidence. It's because you have similar gut bugs.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's, I was taught, of course, take a good family history, because if your father had coronary artery disease, or if your mother was a diabetic, or if somebody had cancer, then there was a strong prediction that you would inherit that. No, it turns out when I take a family history, what I want to know is, what were you taught to eat? What were you eating in the home? Because we now know that people who eat together actually share the same microbiome, and people who commingle share the same microbiome. And it's like the Nature study shows, it's your microbiome makeup that determines whether you're going to be obese, determines whether you're going to be a diabetic, and quite frankly, probably determines whether you're going to get cancer.
Please hear this. This is so fascinating and so true. But this is why these conversations are so important. Your book is so important.
Most people know they want energy. They don't know how to measure it. And what I found in my research and in my clinical practice for the last 20 years is about half the people who come to me initially complain of what we call fatigue and malaise. And their get up and go has got up and gone, as the subtitle of the book says. And what I found, that one of the underlying causes is that we are overfed but undernourished. And if you think about it, we've been taught that to get more energy, we have to have energy bars, we have to have energy drinks, we have to be snacking throughout the day to keep our energy levels up. And it's actually paradoxically making us make less energy. And that's one of the biggest problems in our modern lifestyle. We literally are eating The average American eats 16 hours a day. And we are just constantly overloading our little energy making organelles, which are our mitochondria, with too much work, quite frankly. And we've created this incredible traffic jam in our energy production lines, much like any of us living in Southern California know that rush hour, nothing moves. And particularly here in LA, rush hour can, on the 405, can be 16 hours a day where nothing moves. And the same thing is happening in our energy production. We have constantly now been bombarding our mitochondria, the little energy making organelles, to handle too much food for too long a time.
We've begun to normalize fatigue. We've begun to normalize the need for some kind of superficial energy. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the amazing thing is that most people have been led to believe that because of our modern lifestyles, because of the stresses, and certainly the last year has brought on some fascinating stresses that none of us could have imagined, that this feeling of fatigue, this feeling of low energy is somehow normal. And that we need to, boost periodically throughout the day this kind of low level of normal fatigue. In fact, that's absolutely not true. And one of the things that I go into is why is this kind of chronic fatigue, this low energy, now normalized? And that has to do with because of the way we eat, because of the things we eat. We now have this chronic fire of inflammation that goes on inside of our body. And fire consumes a whole lot of energy. And it's actually the fire of our immune system consuming much of the energy that we would normally produce throughout the day. And this fire is actually what's strapping our energy, because there's, quite frankly, very little left over besides feeding this chronic fire of inflammation. Now, most people have heard about inflammation, but it's becoming clearer and clearer that this inflammation in its source actually comes from leaky gut. And if you had asked me 15 years ago what I thought about leaky gut, I would have laughed you out of the room and called it pseudoscience. We now know, and through the efforts of Dr. Fasano at Harvard and my lab, we now know that almost everyone who has low energy, by definition, has a leaky gut, and that particles like lectins that I talked about before and pieces of bacteria are leaking across the wall of our gut, and our immune system, the same immune system that fights a cold or fights the flu, is using most of our energy to fight the battle that happens from leaky gut, and we're unaware of it.
That's so fascinating. You just said something, it just hit me in a different way with inflammation and fire consuming things, right? And so much of our energy really just being sopped up and absorbed by inflammation in our body.
Yeah.
For example, if somebody's deficient in vitamin D or deficient in magnesium, like you could find those things out, but you can't find like what is that energy metric per se. It's kind of an overarching picture.
Yeah, early in my practice, in the early 2000s, I'd see a number of people complaining of fatigue and low energy, and they would have standard markers of inflammation. The most common one is C-reactive protein. It's capital C, capital R, capital P. I call it crap because it actually makes you feel like crap. And I use an example in the book of a woman in her 40s who came in with a couple of autoimmune diseases, but her initial crap was 10, and normal is supposed to be 1, less than 1. So she was burning up with the fire of inflammation. So we put her on the Energy Paradox program, and I usually see people back in 3 months. And when she came back, she was a different person. And she said, holy cow. I mean, she had lost 15 pounds, which is great, but she said, I don't know what's happened to me. She said, I got so much energy. What's going on? I feel great. And I said, well, look at this. And I show her labs. So her crap had gone from 10 down to 2. Now, it's not perfect, but that's a quantum change. And so she was unaware that, her forest fire was now down to a little smoldering ember. And that's another great point. I can't get over the number of times I've heard, well, I need to eat anti-inflammatory foods, or I need to eat anti-inflammatory supplements or vitamins. Let me tell you, with the amount of inflammation that's going on in most people, that forest fire, by eating anti-inflammatory foods and taking a couple supplements, that's like using a garden hose to put it out. So we have to go to the root cause of that forest fire, and that stems back to the fact that most of us, because of our habits, because of our foods, we have leaky gut. And the whole book goes into how this got out of control and how to put the fire out.
It's not just our bodies as well. When we're talking about this energy deprivation, it's the food. It's the very food that we're eating. And you really break down how our food is now lacking complex energy now. And you talk about why that is. So part of this has to do with the soil.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been fascinated with is the more I've studied plants, the more I've been impressed that we are basically a plant that carries its soil around with it. So plants have roots that go into soil, and that soil is actually a complex living system of its own microbiome and its own set of nutrients. And one of the things that's been clear is we've totally destroyed the soil that plants live in. We've used biocides, herbicides, insecticides, we've monocropped, and so our soil is actually dead. So even though a plant may look like a plant, maybe a leaf of spinach looks like a leaf of spinach, it's nothing like that spinach of 50 years ago. In fact, the U.S. Senate in 1936, almost 100 years ago, said our soil is now so depleted of nutrients that we could eat continuously and never get the nutrients we need to sustain a healthy life. 90 years ago, they knew this. And one of the theories of all this is we are seeking out nutrients, and we keep eating until we get those nutrients. And one of the interesting theories of obesity is, guess what? You can eat and eat and eat, and we are nutrient depleted in all of our food sources, and you'll never get them. The second thing that's really exciting is, speaking of the gut, it turns out our gut is the same surface area, the lining of our gut, as a tennis court. And the reason it has such a surface area, because everybody looks down their gut and say, there's no tennis court down there, is we actually have roots. We have a shag carpet on the inside of our gut. And these roots are called microvilli, and they literally are similar to the roots of a plant. And the soil of us is actually our microbiome, those trillions and trillions of bacteria and fungi and worms, and the food we eat make basically compost, if you will. And our roots go into that soil. And we're turning everyone into a great gardener. And if we take care of our soil and take care of our roots, we will actually increase our ability to extract energy from the food we eat.
We want to be healthy, robust plants, not necessarily Little Shop of Horrors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Feed me, Seymour.
And I love that analogy, by the way, of, we really are plants that have gotten up and walking around, and we've taken the soil with us. But, I've said this statement many times, and I talk about this in my book as well, that chronic nutrient deficiency leads to chronic overeating, period.
Yeah.
We have this innate drive through our evolution to seek out nutrients to help our bodies to run processes. Very simple principle, but the more we're eating deficient foods, we might get some substance in our body for a time, But those mechanisms that are calling out for copper, for boron, for magnesium.
Magnesium, yeah.
Yeah. They're just going to be going off continuously until we get our needs met. And you mentioning that 90 years ago, saying the soil is already just devastated, and where we are today, oh my goodness.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the book, this is a U.S. Senate document. It starts one of my chapters. And I actually, when I address physician groups, I actually put this slide up of this quote from the Senate. But I don't put the date. And I asked them, guess when, this quote from the Senate was. And people say, 2000 or, 1980. And then I flash up 1936. And people go, what? We've known this long that we've had this problem, and no one's done anything about it.
Yeah. Until now.
Now we're going to get the roots and soil back to normal.
That's right. I love it.
You and I'll do it. Come on.
Just me and you, hand in hand. You know what? This really gets into the conversation for me of like, what does it look like when we have a robust, healthy root system and soil internally? And we know what that looks like based on the data from folks who are eating closer to more of an indigenous diet,
Exactly.
which you talk about as well.
Yeah, this was one of the real eye-openers. I knew about this study long ago. The Hadzas in Tanzania are one of the last surviving hunter-gatherers that really stick to their traditional culture. And the men go off hunting every day. They walk 8 to 10 miles. The women gather berries and tubers, and they walk on average 3 to 4 miles a day. And they're very thin and very fit. So researchers said, gee, let's look at the energy expenditure of these people and compare them to the modern office worker. And I bet you we're going to find, because these guys are lean and fit and they're walking all over the place, that these guys, are lean and fit because they're burning through energy and they're just, energy consuming, whereas the desk workers, they're, sitting there, sitting on their ass all day. And what they found just shocked them. The energy expenditure of the Hadzas was exactly the same as a desk worker. And you go, what? How can that be? Well, in research, we have to make a conclusion. Otherwise, we won't publish our paper. So these guys said, well, the reason for that is that everyone's got a set amount of energy expenditure, and it's universal across the board. And I went, what? No. What's happening with these desk workers who clearly aren't producing energy by moving? They're using up their energy with this fire of inflammation, and all their extra energy is being consumed in this fire. And it's just the most amazing thing that we had missed that obvious point. Energy was being produced and consumed, but it was being consumed rather than being used to do things.
Yeah.
Like walk 8 miles.
Right. Man, the human body is just amazing and resilient. Now, what about the microbiome of these folks versus the average person in the Western world?
I'm glad you asked. So these guys, we'll use them as an example. They vary their diet seasonally. During the summer, which is their dry season, they hunt and eat wild animals. During the wet season, they actually eat a lot of berries. They actually consume a lot of honey. And their microbiome changes dramatically from season to season. And the number of species in their microbiome is very, very diverse. It's moving, it's organic, it's like a tropical rainforest, all these different species. You compare that to us, any Western diet, and we have a very non-diverse microbiome. We have very few species, and it never changes. And what we think is important is that those species do need to change on a circadian rhythm basis, on a seasonal basis, to actually tell our mitochondria how to produce energy. And this is probably one of the most startling discoveries in the book. And if I may talk about postbiotics.
Yes, please
Okay,
do.
so everybody, postbiotics, what the heck is a postbiotic? So everybody knows probiotics. These are the friendly bacteria, and you eat your yogurt to get your probiotics, or you eat your sauerkraut to get your probiotics. Believe it or not, folks, you don't get any probiotics from sauerkraut, but that's another story. Prebiotics are the fibers that friendly bacteria have to eat to, number one, stay alive, and number two, to produce chemical messengers that are called postbiotics that actually tell mitochondria, their sisters in all of our cells, whether to make a lot of energy or whether to throttle back on energy production. And the discovery of this communication system actually won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1998. But it's only recently been discovered that there is a language between the microbiome and us, our genes, our cells, that is primarily gases. Like, for instance, fun fact, hydrogen gas. So everybody farts, and everybody seems to be embarrassed by farting, but I actually tell readers to step on the gas, because the more gases that people make by eating prebiotics, the more you actually tell your mitochondria to produce more energy. Whoa.
That when I literally highlighted this because you talked about how bodily gases are important for our mitochondrial function and neurotransmitter function and hormone signaling. And you labeled these gasotransmitters.
Yeah, they're called gasotransmitters or gasomessengers, but it's actually now described as trans-kingdom communication. So the kingdom of bacteria and the kingdom of fungi actually talk to the animal kingdom and even the plant kingdom through gases. We knew that there was somehow an exchange of information, but we didn't know what it was. And literally the discovery of these things is as important as the discovery of the Enigma code in World War II, where we broke the German language code in World War II, and it was called Enigma. And this discovery just opens up so many possibilities. Let me give you hydrogen as an example. So we know from work in Japan that people with Parkinson's disease and neurodegenerative disease don't have a microbiome that produces hydrogen gas. And people who don't have Parkinson's have a microbiome that produces hydrogen gas. So you give people with Parkinson's disease hydrogen water, which is hydrogen dissolved in water. They get better as hydrogen. You can absorb hydrogen by drinking it. They get better by replacing hydrogen. Even something as rotten as hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell, turns out to be incredibly beneficial for telling mitochondria to make energy, number one, and actually give them a substrate to make energy. And it's probably really good for your brain function as well. So who knew that, in some cultures, it's actually a sign of respect for the chef to break wind at the table.
I bet everybody didn't think we'd be talking about farting today.
Plants were here first, and they had it really good. They were actually here for 90 million years before their predator arrived, which was insects. Now, if you think about it, plants had it great because nobody wanted to eat them. And believe it or not, plants do not want to be eaten. They are subject to the same evolutionary pressures that animals are. They want to grow, and they want to make babies, their seeds, and they want to make sure their babies grow. So when their predators arrived, plants had a real problem because, like you mentioned, they can't run, they can't hide, they can't fight. But what they are is chemists of incredible ability. I mean, they can turn sunlight into matter, and we haven't figured out how to do that yet. So what they do is basically chemical warfare. And they have a variety of proteins at their disposal. And one of the ones I really focus on in the book are called lectins. Some people think I'm saying leptin, the anti-hunger hormone. Some people think I'm saying lecithin, the emollient, but it's lectin. So lectins are proteins that are sometimes called sticky proteins because they actually go after certain sugar molecules. And the idea of a lectin is to disrupt cellular communication, particularly in their original predator, which was an insect. And one of the cool things about lectins is they'll actually bind to a sugar molecule that is between nerve endings. It's called sialic acid, and there's not going to be a test, so don't worry.
Yeah.
Uh, and it disrupts one nerve talking to another. And so the insect would be paralyzed. And that's a pretty good deterrent.
Right.
As animals got used to these things, there became an escalating warfare. Give you an example, a great example. So young leaves of trees don't have very many lectins in them. And then as they get mature, the lectin content goes up. So caterpillars actually hatch in the springtime when the new leaves are coming out because they don't have as many lectins. And they don't hatch in the middle of the summer because the plant has mature lectins. But get this, if a caterpillar starts munching on one side of a tree, within 10 minutes, the other side of the tree will increase its lectin production tenfold. So plants actually know what's happening to them. And we talk about in the plant paradox how you can actually stimulate the noise of a caterpillar,
Right.
and the plant will actually increase its lectin production only to that noise of a caterpillar munching, and it won't do it to a similar vibration.
Right.
So plants are really smart. One of the things that really amazed me a number of years ago is Michael Pollan's first book was actually called The Botany of Desire. It was actually how plants manipulate their predators to do their bidding. And it had an amazing effect on me that, in fact, plants aren't just sitting there waiting to take it. They are sentient beings. And, I am a plant predator, I admit it. But you got to
Yeah.
know, you got to know which plants you're actually evolved to eat and which plants you're absolutely not evolved to eat. And that's what the plant paradox does.
Right, right. And so many different levels. And there's some stuff in between too. There's a little bit of gray area as well that you address in the book. And the one study, and you just mentioned it, they actually simulated the caterpillar munching. And they also put that up against like the wind blowing very hard. And there was no increase in the production. And you put in the book some mildly toxic mustard oils. Just when they think the caterpillar is
Yeah.
starting to bite on the leaf, the plant will start to produce more protection. It's just mind-blowing stuff. And you also mentioned, the plants have their babies as well, which are these seeds. So let's talk about some of the different ways that plants ensure that their babies can live on.
Yeah, great question. So plants have a strategy and to make sure their babies make it. And there's essentially two types of seeds that plants make. One, the plant protects its baby with a hard outer shell, uh, kind of like an M&M. So the
Mhm.
shell is actually indigestible by whoever eats them. And the plant actually wants the animal to eat that baby. And then the baby is going to pass through the intestines of the animal, and the animal's going to walk off. And then the animal is going to take a crap and going to deposit that baby a bit of ways away from the mother plant with a generous dollop of fertilizer. And so most fruits actually utilize that strategy. The plant wants you to eat that fruit, so you'll swallow its babies, and it wants you to eat lots of those fruits. And as I talk about in the book, the plant actually induces us to eat as many fruits as possible. Number one, by telling us the color
Mhm.
of the fruit. And most of us don't realize that the only animals that have color vision are actually fruit predators. Great apes have color vision because they are fruit predators. You and I have it because we are great apes. Birds have color vision. And interestingly enough, dogs don't have color vision because they could care less what color a squirrel is. If it's running, if it's running, they want to eat it. And in fact, they look for movement, and that's why a rabbit or a cat freezes when a dog goes by, because the dog can't see the cat or the rabbit if it's not moving. So plants, again, how smart they are, they actually use red colors, yellow colors, orange colors to tell us that the sugar content is at its maximum and that we'll benefit from it. But it also tells us that the baby is now encased in a hard shell that we can't digest. So the reason, for instance, General Mills and Kellogg's uses orange and yellow and red packaging,
Right.
and most snack food companies use this, is because that actually hits our brain and says, oh, wow, it's fruit season and we should be
Mm.
eating as much of this stuff as we can. Pretty cool,
Wheaties,
huh?
Wheaties, Cheerios, Honey Nut
Wheaties,
Cheerios. Yes.
all use those colors.
That's built into my mental Rolodex because my stomach is growling. I feel a little bad saying it, but many a Honey Nut Cheerio doth pass my lips in my day. So that's so crazy. I never thought about that.
Yeah, I used to love Captain Crunch. But think about it. Marketers know that if you're hauling your kid down the aisle in the snack food section or in the cereal section, those colors are going to hit this deep ingrained place in your brain and says, oh, wow, this is where we should be getting calories, and mommy, buy this for me. And I can't
Right.
understand why you're not buying this for me. Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah.
you mentioned, obviously, that's one transportation method or kind of survival for the babies. And then also, what do we have?
So there are a lot of plants that don't want their babies to be carried out someplace. They want to have them drop and stay. And those in general are the grasses and beans. And they're usually in open fields. They want to drop. The next generation wants to go exactly where mom lived. And so these are what I call in the book naked babies. They don't have a hard protective shell. But instead, what they have is a outer hull that contains primarily what are called lectins that are designed to make the animal think twice about eating them, by either making the animal hurt, by making the animal not thrive, by making the animal not reproduce well. And the smart animal says, every time I eat these plants, or the babies, my allergies flare up, for example, for you, or my joints hurt, example for me, or I get a migraine headache, and that's probably a really dumb thing to have. And I'm not going to eat these plant babies anymore. I'm going to go do something else. In general, the plant won, the animal won, and everybody was happy. Now, then humans arrived. Now, unfortunately, humans are really stupid. And we'll eat these things and feel lousy or not thrive or have a migraine headache when you're doing a heart transplant, and not realizing it's certain things that you're putting in your mouth that are causing this. And we'll take Aleve or Advil, or we'll take Nexium or Prilosec, and we'll just keep eating this stuff.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I'm trying to teach people is these are not things that are supposed to happen to you. Arthritis is not natural. Migraine headaches are not natural. Heartburn's not natural. I got news for you. Heart disease is not natural.
Mm.
And when we look at cultures that have figured this out, you start seeing that they don't eat a lot of the things that we think are good for us.
Right. And you outline that so well in the book. And I would love to talk a little bit more before we get to some of the specific foods. And it's probably going to surprise a lot of people where we're going to find these concentrations of lectins in some of these different foods. A lot of people today, obviously, wheat is the big the one with the big billboards. People are talking about that. But there are several other things in wheat besides the lectins that the plant is using as a deterrent. So let's talk about a few of those, the tannins and phthalates, things like that.
Yeah, so lectins are just one part of the defense system, and there are phytates, which actually are really well designed to prevent you from absorbing proteins and absorbing minerals. And interestingly enough, there are animals that are really designed to be predators of grains. So, for instance, rodents. Rodents are grain predators. And one of the things I point out in my book is that rodents in general have 10 times the amount of what are called proteases that break down these anti-animal compounds, and we don't have them, which is another example for the fact that we have not evolved to be good predators for these plants and plant babies like wheat. The other thing that's really scary about wheat, everybody knows about gluten. Gluten happens to be a lectin, and it's a real lectin, but in the scheme of things, gluten is actually, in my book, down the list of the major lectins.
Mm.
And actually, the hull of wheat contains probably the worst lectin of all, which is called wheat germ agglutinin. It's nicknamed WGA. And wheat germ agglutinin is in the hull. It's not in the endosperm, the white part. So the advice to eat whole grain or whole wheat or whole brown rice is actually one of the biggest mistakes we've ever made. And because traditional cultures have tried to mill off the hull. For instance, 4 billion people use rice as their staple, but 4 billion people use white rice as their staple, and they've been getting rid of the hull of brown rice for 8,000 years. And the
Mm.
same way the French use white flour, they have white baguettes, they have white croissants. The Italians, they have white pasta. I mean, the idea of whole wheat pasta is such an anathema to an Italian, and yet now in the tourist areas of Italy, you see whole wheat pasta. And
Mm.
you're right, it tastes awful. And the Italians have been throwing the hull away for, generations, because that's where one of the big problems is.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because the French paradox, and you talked about this in the book. We see about half the rate of heart disease with the French who are eating the foods that you just talked about, and also, and you mentioned this as well, they live about 2.5 years longer on average. So it's just like, let's look at the results. And you mentioned 4 billion people. So we're talking about countries in Asia, for example, Japan, China, India, same thing. And this was a big revelation for me personally, because I remember the last kind of fast food-ish meal that I had. I literally remember this. And this was over 15 years ago. And it was at this Chinese restaurant, which is kind of like a fast food kind of Chinese restaurant. And I was sitting there and I was eating my whatever, hot braised chicken, whatever. And I saw that the owners, like their family, there's like their kids and their wife were eating like white rice and vegetables. And I was like looking at my plate and looking at theirs. And I was just thinking, I need to eat brown rice with this because I was trying to get healthy. And you just like look at the results. They figured this out a long time ago. And they're not eating this stuff that I'm eating. The messed up part is that they were selling it to me. But, in the grand scheme of things, again, somebody figured this out thousands of years ago that this could be a potential issue.
Yeah, what beginning in college, what I did was, study why people did the things they did to the food they ate. And, was it tradition or, why did they do this? I mean, for instance, like quinoa, like I talk about in the book, the Incas had 3 detoxification processes to get the toxins out of quinoa. They would soak it for 48 hours and then they would ferment it. They'd let it rot and then they'd cook it. And it's not on the package directions. And as
Right.
I talk about it in the book, and I've now seen this several more times since the book came out. I had a lovely 40-year-old woman who moved from Lima, Peru to LA, and she wanted to continue her traditional diet, which contained a lot of quinoa. And her mother had always pressure cooked her quinoa, and she thought it was just this,
Mm.
wives' tale. So when she moved to LA, she started eating quinoa, not pressure cooked. And she got horrible, irritable bowel and just felt awful. And a friend convinced her to come out to visit me. And, I'm going down the list, and I said, okay, now quinoa is so toxic. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, quinoa's toxic. You got to pressure cook it. And she said, wait a minute. My mother just flew from Lima 2 weeks ago and said, you stupid girl. She took her to Bed Bath and Beyond and bought her a pressure cooker. And she
Mm.
said, didn't I tell you have to pressure cook quinoa because it's so bad for you if you don't? And she said, you're telling me my mother was right? And I said, oh, yeah. I said, call me back in a month. And so she called me back. She says, yeah, you and mom are right. It was the pressure cooker. And just last week, I saw a woman from Brazil who, up until they were 11 years old, her mother always pressure cooked her rice and beans. And then their pressure cooker broke and they
Mm.
stopped pressure cooking the rice and beans. And she said, I can tell you the day that all my health issues started. It was the day my mother stopped pressure cooking rice and beans. She said, I started developing allergies. I lost my tonsils. I, got an autoimmune disease. And she said, I read your book. And she said, holy cow, it was like somebody turned on a light bulb. And she said, it was the day our pressure cooker broke. And so now she's fine again. But it was a great story.
Yeah,
And so there you go.
that's
So
profound.
pressure cooking breaks lectins. It won't break the gluten lectins, so don't go home and pressure cook your, brown rice or your wheat. It won't work, but it'll kill all other lectins. I have a lot of snowbirds in my practice that, go away for the summer and then come back in the winter. And I have an 85-year-old woman who I recently saw who is a snowbird, and she came back this fall to Palm Springs, and she's married to an 86-year-old gentleman. She's in my practice. He thinks that what she and I do is just the silliest thing and wants nothing to do with it. Then one of the things we did, among other things, I always run everybody's vitamin D very high. I've never seen vitamin D toxicity. And we do a lot of other things with food, as you know. And he just poo-pooed it. And yeah, he's 85, what the heck. So they both caught COVID-19 at the end of March. And so, I saw her a few weeks ago and I said, well, wow, what was that like? And she said, well, for me, it wasn't much of anything. She said, I felt like, I had a bad cold for 48 hours and that was it. She said, my husband wound up in intensive care for 56 days, nearly didn't make it. He just got released from the hospital 3 weeks ago. So he was in the hospital for literally 6 months. And so she leans over to me and she says, guess what he's taken now? A lot of vitamin D. And he says, I should have listened to you. And just yesterday, before coming here, I have a Hispanic woman in her 50s. The entire family caught COVID except her. She's my only patient. And her husband actually died from COVID, a 55-year-old gentleman, Hispanic gentleman. And so, I mean, this is decimating a lot of our communities. And I think it's because a lot of our communities, number one, aren't aware that food is one of the greatest ways that we can protect ourselves or learn to cooperate with the viruses and bacteria and molds that are always going to be present with us. And it's this balance
Yeah.
that can be achieved.
right now, somewhere around 70 million confirmed cases and of people who are okay, who survived. And the question is, how do they do it? Vast majority of them didn't even have any symptoms. No, I'm sorry. We'll say somewhere close to half. How do they do that without some kind of medical intervention? Their immune system did what it was designed to do. And our immune system is literally made from food. It's made from our natural killer cells to our T cells. The list goes on and on. Our lymphatic system, everything about us is made from the food that we eat. This should definitely be a top priority, but I'm just going to ask you, why is it not a part of this conversation? Why is the task force not up there saying, okay, guys, make sure that you wash your hands, but also we really need to hone in on getting our food together as a society?
It's bad for business. I had recently on my podcast David Kessler, who was the former head of the FDA. He's been dean of Yale Medical School, dean of UCSF Medical School. He's now on President-elect Biden's COVID task force. And when he was head of the FDA, the food nutrition label was made on the back of packages. And as he tells the story, when there's this much fat and this much sugar and this much protein, and when they were working on the sugar label, he wanted to make sure that everyone knew that carbohydrates were sugar, and that all carbohydrates should be labeled as sugar. And so this was sent to the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Agriculture called the president and said, you can't let this maniac do this. And the president calls David Kessler and said, get over here. And big agriculture's there, big food's there, and they go, what are you doing? You can't tell people how much sugar is in these products. And he said, well, what do you mean? That's what's in it. And they said, no one would buy this. And this is what we sell. This is what the Department of Agriculture does. Fix it. And so he tells this great story, and I'll tell it to anyone who will listen. He said, let's take a bagel. And he says, so you look at that, there's 0 fat in the bagel, there's a couple grams of protein in the bagel, and it says 33 grams of carbohydrates, 0 grams of sugar. And you go, oh, that's a health food. And he says, no. He said, it turns out that those finely processed starch molecules in wheat are so highly processed that it is more sugar than table sugar. And so if you do the calculations correctly, there are 8 teaspoons of sugar in that healthy bagel that will raise your blood sugar faster than if you swallowed 8 teaspoons of table sugar. And he said, and you won't see it on the label because we're not allowed to tell you.
Wow. That's really messed up.
It's really messed up. And, I give a lecture to the diabetics. And during the Obama administration, when Michelle Obama was planting victory gardens at the White House and was educating kids, particularly in the black community, about the importance of fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, at the same time, the Department of Agriculture signed a deal with Domino's Pizza that they would pay $100 million in free advertising for Domino's Pizza if Domino's Pizza would add twice the amount of cheese to their pizzas than they were previously. And they actually made a big fanfare of the fact that the Department of Agriculture was supporting, our farmers, our dairy farmers. At the same time, Michelle Obama was supporting, healthy eating. And so that's the tug, that's the tear. And, and this is people listening to you, people have to be aware that nobody from up is going to tell us the right way to eat. This has to be a grassroots movement, and it has to start with all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that I definitely I'm very big on the Jerry Maguire show me the money, and kind of tracing that thing back. I just don't want to operate on a theory. And so, of course, the theory would be that the major crops that our government provides subsidies for, hundreds of billions of dollars, are making us sick. That's the theory. But I went and traced it, and I came across an incredible study, and they tracked the pathway of these massive factory farmed crops, the wheat and the corn and all these things that largely show up through the drive-through window and in processed foods. And they tracked the consumption. And the folks who had the greatest consumption of these government subsidized crops were 40% more likely to be obese. We know this.
Yeah.
And these are the very foods that our government is funding for us to eat. And then it circles back around to us getting caught in the system of medicine. And now we're paying for pills. But the funny thing is, even when I say our government, we're paying for it.
Sure.
That's the most messed up part, And I think that if we really get this, we can demand better. But I just think we just don't know that this is happening. And so I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. Yesterday, I looked out the window and I saw the mailman pull up to my neighbor's mailbox. He already had gloves on. He sanitized his hands with the gloves. Then he reached for the mail, put in the mailbox. He pulled up to our mailbox, sanitized his hands and his gloves, reached for the mail, put in our mailbox. And I'm sure he kept doing that all the way down the street. And my question is, we know that many of these products are, they're designed to kill small things, right? It's what they're meant to do, antibacterial, antiviral, whatever the case may be. And now we're at a place where even when I went to the DMV, once you get up from your chair, literally somebody comes over and starts spraying down the chair, wiping everything down. Could these products be creating a problem for our health as well? That we're not just using, now I believe we're overusing to the degree that, when kids are in school, if they get to go to school, they have so many of these crazy, synthetic, dangerous products that obviously they're going to be inhaling, obviously they're going to be interacting, putting on their skin. Should we be a little bit more aware that this is happening?
Yeah, the idea that these disinfectants are going to protect us is, particularly with COVID-19, is a bit naive. COVID-19 is really an airborne virus, and it really does not survive well on surfaces for very long. And what's fascinating about COVID-19, and there's some really cool studies out of China that are just now being published about transmission in restaurants. And it actually has to do with airflow, where the fans or ventilation or open windows are in restaurants. And they've tracked through really good contact tracing, who was getting it. And so, for instance, if we're in this room, if someone across the room is facing me, and I happen to have asymptomatic COVID, and the window behind me is open, then that person facing me has a pretty doggone good chance of catching it. Whereas if that person is opposite and facing the other way, he's not going to get it. And same thing with the tangential people, they're not going to get it. So it's the air movement that's actually critical. So all the little hand washing things out in the mailbox, that's not going to protect us. But you're right. I mean, we learned with Ticacin, which we used to be in all of our toothpaste, it used to be in all of our antibacterial cleansers, that this thing is a major estrogen disruptor.
Yeah.
And, talk about promoting obesity by sanitizing, our skin and sanitizing our teeth and our mouthwash. Little did we know that we were, swallowing an estrogen-like substance. And it's like, oh, I don't want to do that. And who knows what the rest of these products are going to have. We just don't know. That's not what we need to do. We need to fortify our cells. We need to become, one with the earth, to be, silly. If we have a great terroir, there's really not much that's going to happen to us. Yeah, we might catch COVID, but like you say, the vast majority of people who catch it are just going to have a mild interaction with this virus. We have mild interactions with viruses probably every day that we're not aware of, and our immune system takes care of it. May I bring up one other point about that?
Please do.
Okay. So we hear about cytokine storms. So our immune system, I like to use the example of 95% of us are born with a preformed antibody to peanut, the peanut lectin. Lectins are one of my favorite subjects. So 95% of us are born with an antibody that if we see a peanut lectin, we should hate it. When I was growing up, there were no such things as peanut allergies. Kids ate peanuts in schools. Nobody carried EpiPens to school. Now, of course, we have an epidemic of peanut allergies, and kids literally are carrying EpiPens to school. We've always had antibodies to peanuts. So why is it now that those antibodies are going crazy and they never did before? And that's because our microbiome, number one, educates our immune system. It tells the immune system, hey, we got you covered. We're the first line of defense. We're going to see these guys, whatever they are, long before you. We're going to eat them or we're going to detoxify them. And if they get past us, just chill out. It's okay. They're not as bad actors as you think. And immune system actually learns from our microbiome. And there's actually really cool microscopic pictures of filamentous bacteria going through the walls of our intestinal cells and making like kind of ET contact with, they're in our human cells, teaching human cells. It's like, woo. So the immune system learns. Now, contrast that now that we have a decimated microbiome because we've killed them all with all the antibiotics in our food and that we take. Not only that, we now have, most of us have leaky gut because of the things we eat. And now our immune system is on high alert. It's like our borders are constantly under attack. We're on threat level 5. And so if we see a potentially not very interesting foreign antigen, like say a COVID-19, before our immune system would go, yeah, that's a pretty interesting guy. Yeah, let's go eat it and, we'll be okay. Now our immune system drops a nuclear bomb and we have this cytokine storm calling our immune system, onto high alert. And it's no wonder that these cytokine storms are happening to our people with pre-existing diseases. And so it's no wonder if you don't have these pre-existing diseases and you've got yourself in good immunologic shape and you got a healthy microbiome, then it's just, it's another interesting virus.
This is beyond fascinating and such a needed conversation. And I know folks are wondering what they can do. Obviously, there's been a lot of framing of fear, worry, uncertainty, an incapability to even take care of oneself, just hide out and wait for a solution to come along. And of course, we've talked about, of course, you want to be intelligent, exercise, caution, but most importantly, we have to be a little bit more empowered in getting ourselves healthier and more resilient. So if you could, you've already mentioned one, which is the vitamin D piece, which is so important, especially as you mentioned, for folks with more melanin. It's like built-in sunscreen, and so we evolved in a space where, we got a lot more sun exposure. And so your body kind of builds up a resistance. So you need a little bit more. So if we can, of course, get some sun exposure, but really important right now, I think, would be to supplement with vitamin D. So if you can talk about where we should target there, and maybe one other thing, maybe two if you can, if you feel called to, things that we can do right now proactively to make ourselves more resilient.
Let me give you something else that we learned from World War II. Now, I've already talked about when rationing was instituted, how much healthier everyone got. Certainly that's number one. But one of the striking, sad findings, and that was actually really important, was the concentration camp survivors. Obviously, large number of people died in concentration camps, but the survivors, who were literally starved to death for the most part, one of the shocking things among the survivors was that these people never were ill, never got the flu, never got a cold, never got cancer. And you would have thought that in their profound weakened condition, that they'd be a setup for, catching a death of a cold, getting pneumonia, but they didn't. And that was actually, researchers said, that doesn't make any sense. Their immune system ought to be shot. They should be a setup. What's the deal? Well, it turns out that fasting is actually one of the best ways to make your immune system strong, because we're designed, and I talk a lot about this in my books, we're designed in crisis, if you will, that our green life force energy will empower every system to protect you, because if you don't make it through this hard time, you're not going to be around to reproduce. And at the end of the game, that's what we got to keep around to do. So it was actually these concentration camp survivors that were the impetus, sadly, to find out why simple fasting actually gets your immune system revved up to protect you. So what I ask people to do is, folks, just start skipping breakfast. If you wanted to do one thing to change your ability to fight infection, skip breakfast. And everybody goes, but breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Well, I can assure you that our ancestors didn't crawl out of the cave and say, what's for breakfast? There wasn't any breakfast. There wasn't a refrigerator. There wasn't a pantry shelf. There was nothing. We had to find, break, fast. And you look at hunter-gatherers like the Hansas, they don't eat breakfast. They head out and they may eat breakfast at lunch, but we're designed not to eat breakfast. Breakfast is a cultural phenomenon, and quite honestly, big food taught us that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Remember, no one ever ate a bowl of cereal until 1906. Never existed. The Brits never had a bowl of cereal until 1941, when America arrived and brought it. Didn't exist as a food.
It's power of marketing.
Power of marketing. If you say an untruth long enough and loud enough, it will become true. Longevity is called hormesis, and the best description of that is Nietzsche's "that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger." And so stressing cells actually basically makes the cell realize that, hey, times are really rough, makes an organism say, ooh, hard times are here. We've got to get through this, and we've got to look at every cell and say, are you pulling your weight? Do you look a little odd? And it basically tells the cell to self-destruct or to eat itself. And these are signals that are started, among other ways, by fasting. So if there is a period of time that it doesn't look like you're going to get the next meal, you really take stock of everything that's going on and say, okay, you got to go. You're not pulling your own weight. You look really fit. You get to stay. And it's our own mechanism of self-pruning the dead wood, if you will. One of our big problems in our society is in the good old days, we had built-in periods of fast because there were famines. There were periods of time, particularly in the winter, where there wasn't much food. And so we had a built-in circadian rhythm of a period of growth, like in the spring and summer, and then a period of what I call regression in the fall and winter. And that's when all the pruning was done. Well, now we have 365 days a year of growth. It's endless summer. We have access to food 24 hours a day, and that
25 hours a day.
yeah, that's right. And some nutritionists have given people the unfortunate advice that the way to be healthy is to eat 6 small meals a day, or to snack between meals, or make sure you take a snack before you go to bed. And it's actually one of the worst things you can do. We, as humans, took over the world because we're actually the only fat ape. We have the ability to store fat. And you don't see a lot of fat chimps and gorillas. Now, gorillas look fat because that giant gut, that's a fermentation vat, but they're actually incredibly lean. Most great apes have 3% body fat. 3%.
How much you lift, bro? That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyhow, we need to have periods of fasting to actually stimulate stem cells to grow. And the really cool thing about fasting is you get to call your bacterial herd in your gut. If they don't have anything to eat, particularly the bad guys they just leave. They don't have anything to eat. But here's the really cool thing about fasting. The guys who remain are these crazy guys, Akkermansia mucinophila, because they're living on the mucus. And the mucus is still there even if you're not eating. So they not only survive, but they become a bigger part of your gut flora. And the more you're stressed, the more they divide, the more mucus you make, and the more stem cells that you actually stimulate to grow just by fasting. Now everybody says, oh, geez, I have to eat. I can't fast. Well, my good friend, Dr. Walter Longo here at USC, who's the head of the Longevity Center at USC, has shown, actually definitively in humans, that a 5-day vegan calorie-restricted diet for 5 days of about 900 calories, done once a month, will have the exact same effect as if you calorie restricted for the entire month. And he calls it the calorie restriction mimicking diet. And it's part of my longevity paradox program. So the good news is, you don't have to do a water fast for 3 days. If you want to, it's great, but you can act as if you were fasting and achieve the same effect. More importantly, the longer you go in time period between meals, the better off you're going to be from a longevity standpoint, and particularly from your brain standpoint. And can we get into brainwash days by any chance?
Of course.
All right.
Of course.
So here's another really important thing. Through the years, I've become quite good friends with Dr. Dale Bredesen, who wrote The End of Alzheimer's. Probably, in my opinion, one of the 2 top neurologists in this country working on brain health. The other one's David Perlmutter, who I had on my podcast, the Dr. Gundry podcast, last week. So the deal is that we now know that the brain has to go through a wash cycle every night to get rid of toxins, debris, amyloid. Everybody knows about amyloid plaques in Alzheimer's. And that brain wash is done with what's called the glymphatic system. The brain actually shrinks normally about 20% to allow this wash of lymphatic fluid to clean out all this debris. Now, that actually needs incredible blood flow. Now, you and I are from the Midwest. When I was growing up, after you ate lunch, my mother would not allow me to go swimming for 1 hour after we ate because she knew that you would get cramps and die. And there was a bit of truth to that old wives' tale. Digestion needs a lot of blood flow. And after we eat, we send huge amounts of blood flow to our intestines for digestion. That means if I went out swimming, my muscles would not get enough blood flow and they'd get a cramp and I'd die. Well, it turns out the brain needs that blood flow to have a brain wash. So Dr. Bredesen has shown that you probably need 3, maybe 4 hours after your final meal of the day before you go to sleep so that the blood isn't down in your intestines and can go up to your brain. Now you think about that with our lifestyle, and where unfortunately our biggest meal of the day is usually dinner. There's a great old saying that eat like a king at breakfast, a queen at lunch, and a pauper at dinner for longevity. And it's probably one of the best advice ever given. But we don't do that. And then we have a snack before we go to bed. And that's the worst possible thing for a brain clean, because sleep, deep sleep, is when we do this cleaning. And for most of us, and I track with an Oura ring, most of us, deep sleep occurs very early in our sleep cycle. And so you're not going to get your brain cleaning if you've eaten a meal right before you go to bed. So I encourage people once a week to have a brain cleaning night, and don't eat dinner. Or if you're going to eat dinner, really eat your last bite by about 5 o'clock in the evening. And do that once a week at the very least to clean your brain. Because everybody realizes we have this incredible epidemic of Alzheimer's, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Not only Alzheimer's, but Parkinson's and dementia. And if people just once a week take the step of having a brain cleaning night where they cut off their last meal. The other thing that Dr. Bredesen would tell you, and I'll tell you, is the longer you go between your last meal of today and the next meal, the better off you're going to be.
And so there's so many different ways to go about this, this label today, intermittent fasting. And it's something that I'm a big prescriber of myself. We haven't talked about this, but the lymphatic system, for a lot of the research that, it said that it's about 10 times more active doing this work during sleep. And we never really think about, you're also not eating during this time period. And if we can extend that a little bit and get that extra brain wash at least once a month, as you're advocating.
Once a week,
my bad. Once a week, we can get all these huge benefits, not just the brainwashing, increase in BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is kind of like miracle grow for some parts of the brain.
Yep.
All of these great benefits. And so, this is very different from, again, what I was taught. Let's have our patients and clients consume 6 to 7 meals a day. You're constantly shoveling. Humans, we're not grazers.
No, we're not.
And we have this immaculate system that's designed. And by the way, this does not mean that you have to do an intermittent fast, but it's just one of those tools, and you can stack conditions in your favor. You give so many different tools and strategies in the book. Another one of them, which was just like an aha moment for me to see it in a book, because this is something I talked about in an episode about enhancing the function of your immune system, is eating seasonally.
Yeah, we are a seasonal animal. That's actually our inheritance. And we ate with the seasons. And it turns out, looking at hunter-gatherers, some of the last ones like the Hansa, their microbiome changes dramatically between the wet season and the dry season. When they go from, their dry season is actually when the fruits and the honey that they eat are available. and their microbiome totally shifts into unrecognizable microbiome. And in the wet season, when they're actually hunting and having animals more, their microbiome changes again. And I think our immune system gets most of its education, most of its information from the microbiome. And that microbiome not only should be diverse and should be happy, we ought to have gut buddies. You know, if you've got a bunch of kids down at the beach with a bonfire and they're all singing camp songs and kumbaya, or maybe they're rapping now, I don't know. The cops, see the kids on the beach and they say, oh, those are good kids. We'll go have a donut. Don't go have a donut, please. But, we don't have to worry about it. We can kind of chill out. But you have come from the mean streets for part of your life. If there's gang members on the street, then the cops, are in their armed vehicles and they've got their AK-47s ready to go because at any minute mischief is going to happen. So we know that gut buddies tell our immune system, hey, it's a wonderful day down here, relax. But if you got bunches of gang members, the immune system is always on guard. Mm-hmm. So I see people with allergies, and I used to have such bad allergies, I took allergy shots, as a teenager and in my 20s. Now I have no allergies. Why? Because my gut buddies are those kids down at the beach, and the cops are out having donuts, and they could care less about whether a ragweed is coming into my nose. They just go, yeah, it's okay, it's nice. So changing your microbiome seasonally is actually how we evolved. And again, there's proof of this in the last remaining, hunter-gatherers. So we shouldn't be eating the same thing 365 days a year. That makes no evolutionary sense, no circadian rhythm sense. And yet that's what most people do.
Yeah. It's just one of those things that's so obvious. But, we live in a different time now where we have, like you said, we have instant access 25 hours a day to food, and oftentimes the same food. And so eating seasonally, paying attention to what nature's providing, specifically in your area during that time of year, can help that transition.
I see a large number of patients with IBS and complaints of gas and bloating, and many of them have tried the FODMAP diet, for example, or the specific carbohydrate diet to eliminate this problem. And I assure my patients, number one, that if you want good mitochondrial health and if you want good energy production, these diets are the exact opposite of what you want for long-term good health, because you have absolutely starved the most important part of your body of the things they need to eat, the microbiome. But what we do is we stepwise reintroduce little bits of these prebiotics, and the whole book is a stepwise introduction of new habits, and this is one of them, a stepwise way. And once you do this, you begin to tolerate those gases, and you get a perfect balance between too little is really bad, too much is really bad, but we want to hit the Goldilocks rule of just right. And that's what we get people to.
Perfect. I want to talk about what we can start to do to heal the gut terrain and what we can do to heal our energy crisis in our bodies. And what's so funny is that things that are good for one thing with the human body tend to be good for a lot of things.
True.
Because we're not actually isolated into parts. Everything kind of works together. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating that you brought up in the book is vitamin D.
Yeah.
How does that play into this role of the energy equation, also our microbiome?
So one of the fascinating things through the years, I measure vitamin D levels on all my patients, and I learned very early that all of my patients with fatigue and also autoimmune disease had very low levels of vitamin D, even though most of them were taking vitamin D. And I began aggressively replacing vitamin D with them, sometimes very high amounts, but I would measure this. And I'd get their vitamin D levels up to at least 100 nanograms per milliliter. Now, some people think that's toxic. I can guarantee you I've never seen vitamin D toxicity. But as we did this, I began to notice that with the other things we were doing, their autoimmune disease markers went down or went away, and that their energy levels started going up. And so I began to really research how vitamin D is doing this. And so back to the lining of our gut, we have these roots, and these roots have these individual cells that are damaged when you get leaky gut. And there's a set of cells called stem cells that replace the damaged cells. And they're really good at this, and it happens all the time, except you have to have vitamin D to push these stem cells awake to close the gaps. Number two, we've learned more and more and more that vitamin D manipulates the immune system, which the immune system actually is the cause of inflammation. And vitamin D tells the immune system to, hey, don't get so crazy, don't get so wild, calm down, relax, everything's fine here. And in people with autoimmune disease, the immune system is haywire, and the immune system doesn't listen to vitamin D very well. So the more we can get vitamin D into people's bodies, and sunlight is a great way to start, but quite frankly, we don't get enough sunlight anymore. But if we can take vitamin D, vitamin D3, I think everyone should have a minimum of 5,000 international units or 125 micrograms. Let me give you a great story of what happened yesterday. Saw a lady in her 40s who has severe candidiasis, and I talk about candida in the book. And it's very rare that I see someone who really suffers from candidiasis, but this woman had such bad candidiasis that her tongue was coated with thrush, and she was taking heavy, big-time antibiotics, antifungals to kill this off, and nothing was working. And her well-meaning doctors told her, well, she had immune deficiency disease, and she was getting IVIG injections every week, and she was miserable, wasting away. So she had come and saw my physician assistant, Mitsu, 3 months ago. And Mitsu, she had a very low vitamin D. Her vitamin D was 23. A bare minimum is 30. In my opinion, bare minimum is 80. So Mitsu said, whoa, wow, we're going to put you on 10,000 international units. And so I saw this woman for the first time yesterday. And she said, you're not going to believe this, but within a week of taking the vitamin D, my thrush went away for the first time in 10 years. And she said, that's really weird. I mean, the antifungals weren't touching it. The antibiotics weren't touching it. And she said, I'm starting to actually gain weight and feel normal. And we measured her vitamin D this time around, and it was up to 50, which is double what she was. And I said, well, this is great. We're going to 20,000 international units, and I guarantee you things are going to get even better. But just vitamin D gave her the ability to ward off or change this fungus's ability to attach to her. Just vitamin D.
That's absolutely remarkable.
Yeah.
And again, this is moving away from the standard of care with that was not working.
Yeah.
And it was one of these very simple principles. And let's be clear on the type of vitamin D. So it's not D2 though.
No, not D2. D2 is quite frankly worthless and maybe actually hazardous. So it's vitamin D3. Doctors used to prescribe vitamin D2, and it was a prescription drug. And you'd take 50,000 units every week or twice a week, and it was useless. But we had a prescription for vitamin D2, and any doctor knows that prescriptions are the way to go. Not.
This is so good, so good. And this just reminds me too, you do talk about this as well, the importance of sunlight and vitamin D3. In a perfect scenario, we'd be getting access to a bit more sun than we do today. It's it's a major epidemic for sure, with folks not getting outside, not getting exposure to sunlight intelligently. And also you talk about, within that context, eating your sunscreen.
Yeah.
Right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I haven't used sunscreen for over 20 years now. And one of the things that people remark about, because I'm now in my 7th decade, they go, "Let me see your skin. Your skin is like a young person's skin." So we have the ability to eat protection from the sun. And for instance, timed release vitamin C is one of the best protectors of UV light there is. And vitamin C is essential for repairing collagen breaks that UV light causes. But equally as important is we can actually produce more melanin, which absorbs sunlight. And by the way, speaking of similarity to plants, we actually produce ATP from our melanin pigment when it's exposed to sunlight, exactly like a plant produces ATP when exposed to sunlight. And there's a lot of plant about us. There's a little bit of plant in all of us. So not only will you get more energy by exposing yourself to the sun, just by using the photons from sunlight to make ATP, but you're going to get a huge brain boost, particularly from early morning and late afternoon sun. These orange and red colors do phenomenal things to make your brain work properly. And that's why anytime we get a chance, early morning light, late afternoon light is just one of the best mood boosters there is.
I love that so much. And just bringing up another simple principle of the colors of foods being an indicator of nutrition, of antioxidants. These are all very basic tenets that we should know about.
Yeah, eat the rainbow and they'll protect you from the damaging parts of sunlight.
You're not talking about like Lucky Charms rainbow.
No, not that rainbow. That's one of the things that's really been detrimental to our energy production. And that is, and I'm glad you brought that up. Kellogg's Corn Flakes was the first advertised pre-digested meal. And yeah, that was their selling point, that you could get more energy because all the components of corn, in this case, were pre-digested. So it took away all the work of digestion and it would instantly become energy. This was actually in the early 1900s. That was the advertising pitch. What's happened with all of our processed and ultra-processed food is exactly that. Everything is now pre-digested. We have sugars that instantly hit our bloodstream. We have proteins that have been broken down into individual amino acids that instantly hit our bloodstream. We have fats that instantly hit our bloodstream. And what happens, as we talk about in the energy paradox, is all three of these components, which your mitochondria can use to produce energy one at a time, rush hour now hits your mitochondria with all of these substances simultaneously, and you literally get energy gridlock. And that explains when, okay, you eat a fast food meal for lunch, and by 2 o'clock you are dragging and your brain doesn't work, and you go, whoa, No, it wasn't the inflammatory food you eat. It wasn't that fast. It was clogging your energy highway with these foods that had no business entering into your circulation, just like wham. So Kellogg's Corn Flakes started all this.
Dr. Kellogg was a big proponent of managing your sexual desires as well, suppression. And this was part of the formula as well, to make you not want to mess with your wang, basically.
Jerk off. Yeah. Yeah, because I was a professor at Loma Linda University Medical School for many years, for much of my career, which is an Adventist institution. So I got to read all the history, and Battle Creek Sanitarium was an Adventist hospital.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Oh, I went back and I actually read some of those old-fangled texts too. And he had all of these symptoms for knowing if your child is masturbating. It was like poor skin, poor posture, hard of hearing. It was just like all of it's basically everything.
Everything, yeah.
Was an indication that your child is masturbating and you need to get them on some cornflakes. So shout out to cornflakes, I guess. Still out there doing his thing.
And quite frankly, since we're on the subject, I have never met a man who couldn't have a normal testosterone level if I got rid of his simple sugars and processed foods. It is one of the best ways to suppress your testosterone that anyone has ever invented. So guys, if your get up and go is got up and gone, if you know what I mean, change your food and watch what happens.
On that note, we're going to extend into the next topic. I'm sorry.
Where's the snare drum?
So this really brings up for me another one of the things that siphons our energy that we've touched on multiple times, but I think we need to really drive this point home, which is how much energy is required for our immune system to function. Because right now, obviously, our immune health is of the utmost importance and at top of people's minds. So can we talk about, number one, the energy requirement for the immune system? And also, can we talk about some things that we can do right now to improve our immune health?
Yeah, we all have heard now ad infinitum about people with pre-existing conditions are much more susceptible to COVID-19. And if they get COVID-19, they're not going to do well. Well, it turns out that all pre-existing conditions are underlying leaky gut is the cause of all of these pre-existing conditions, whether it's diabetes, whether it's heart disease, whether it's autoimmune diseases, whether it's hypertension, whether it's cancer. All of this relates back to the gut and to the inflammation that's going on. So your immune system, 80% of your immune system lines your gut, down in your belly, because that's where stuff is going to come across your border that needs your immune system's attention. And the immune system is an energy hog. And if the immune system needs more energy to fight the invaders that's coming across your gut wall, it's going to take all that energy. And so your viewers and listeners, the example is the flu virus. If you get the flu virus is just a protein, and it has no ability to make you ache, make you feel lousy. But your immune system, when it sees this protein, goes, oh, this is a bad actor, and we need to rev up our troops. We need to fortify the troops. We need all the fuel for the troops. And how are we going to do that? Well, the main consumers normally of energy are muscles and your brain. So what do? You make muscles hurt, make hurt to move, and you make your brain not want to function. All you want to do is sleep or just binge watch something, and certainly not do high mental processing. You get brain fog. Your immune system, your own body, is doing that to you so that your immune system will have all the energy it needs. So one of the sad things is when we have most of our immune system distracted with this chronic inflammation, then it doesn't have the ability to take care of the things it really should have been taking care of. So I see tons of people that absolutely get their immune system distracted because of leaky gut, and they're a setup. I have two older patients. The wives were my patients, the husbands weren't. The wives followed my program, the husbands didn't. Both sets of families got COVID. Both wives, it was a 48-hour illness. They said, felt like a cold, nothing. Both husbands wound up in the ICU. One spent 56 days in the ICU, intubated, spent 6 months in the hospital. The other husband passed away. And it's all because, for instance, both of these women had a vitamin D level of 100, and they'd been following my program. They didn't have leaky gut. So and I've written editorials about this, we have the ability, and we've talked about this, to protect ourselves, to arm ourselves against whatever is coming after us. And we have the ability to do that if we'll just take a few simple steps.
Yeah, this is so remarkable. I think that this leans into one of the things you touched on when we talked last time in addressing this energy crisis, but also improving our immune health. And this is this term that we can really dive in deeper on, which is fasting.
Yeah. So the program in the book, I have an energy equation that I have to give a nod to Einstein. So it's E equals m squared c squared. So energy stands for energy. M squared is microbiome and mitochondria, and we've kind of touched on that. The C squared is what I call chronoconsumption, and that is simplistically limiting the amount of time that you consume food during the day. And then obviously the types of foods that you consume are important with that. Now, everybody's heard of fasting or intermittent fasting or water fasting. I was actually, as far as I know, the first author to write about intermittent fasting in 2006, long before it got de jour. But the important point is when people, particularly in a Western diet, try to intermittent fast, try to extend the length of time that they go without meals, about 80% of people fall flat on their face. They get headaches, they lose energy, and that's because we don't have what's called metabolic flexibility or mitochondrial flexibility. We can't change fuel sources easily, and I go really into depth in why that is. But in my program, what we do is we stepwise slowly have people transition to an intermittent fasting diet. And it's actually very simple. Each week in a 6-week program, we have people, let's say on Monday you eat breakfast at 7 o'clock. Well, we're going to ask you to break fast at 8 o'clock instead of 7 o'clock. And then,
Seems easy
anybody
enough.
can do that, right? And then on Tuesday, we're going to ask you to break fast at 9 o'clock, and so on. Now, we get to Friday, we get to take the weekend off. You don't have to suffer during the weekend if you consider it suffering. Then the next week, we start 1 hour later, and we start the process again. So we'll start at 9 o'clock the next week. And if 10 o'clock is as far as they can make it, that's fine. We hold there, and we try again next week. So what we found in my program is we can slowly but surely reintroduce this time-restricted eating. And quite frankly, probably the best time-restricted eating is around 6 hours. So what that looks like is noon to 6 o'clock eating your calories. But getting back to the immune system, studies in rats and mice and humans show that the more we can reduce your window of eating, the more you're going to have a better microbiome, the more you're going to have an intact gut wall, and paradoxically, the more energy you're going to produce. Because quite frankly, you take away this rush hour traffic jam on your mitochondria, and things are able to move smoothly. What a paradox.
Right. Oh, it's so good.
And you don't have to cut back on calories.
That's the funny part, isn't it?
Yeah, you can, and there's beautiful studies with Italian athletes showing that if you had these athletes eat during a 6-hour window compared to athletes who ate in a 12-hour window, the same calories, the same food, that the group who ate in the 6-hour window lost weight, had more muscle mass than the group that ate for 12 hours. It's like, holy cow, what a win-win. So same calories, so much with the calories in, calories out theory.
One of the most remarkable things about intermittent fasting versus traditional or conventional caloric restriction is the maintenance of your muscle mass.
Yeah.
It's some really remarkable thing your body does, which that supports that long-term fat loss, that long-term energy is carrying and protecting your valuable muscle tissue.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And then I got one more trick. Can I mention?
Please do.
So
yes.
I've mused in all my books about the paradox of what I call mono diets, and that is eating primarily carbohydrates. Like there's a Duke rice diet where basically all you eat is rice. And then there's a typical high protein diet like the original Atkins diet or the carnivore diet. And then there's the ketogenic diet where it's 80% fat. And interestingly, so I call these mono diets. You're choosing one macronutrient. And as long as you do that, it turns out the mitochondria are pretty doggone happy because there's only one set of vehicles on the highway at any one time. There's no trucks, buses, and cars, just cars or just buses. And they're called, and they all work. They really do. And, get over it, folks. Call me out on Twitter, but they all work. Why do they all work? Because it's choosing one fuel and one fuel only. So what I do, the first meal of the day, the break fast, which is where the word came from, is a mono meal. So whether you want to have, give you an example, millet cereal, puff millet cereal with low-fat almond milk, or whether you want to have a shrimp cake, or whether you want to have naturally raised Canadian bacon, just as an example, and you want to change up every day, what kind of crazy diet is that? That you get to have carbs one day and high protein the next day and high fat the next day and change it up? It turns out that your mitochondria for that first meal of the day love the fact that you're only giving them one thing to work with. And it really turbocharges your energy production.
That's fascinating. And again, so simple.
Yeah, it's so simple.
So simple.
And eliminates boredom. I mean, the reason most mono diets fail, the reason 80% of keto diets fail, the reason 80% of Atkins diets fail, is because of boredom. You run out of interesting things to eat.
And we don't like that. Humans don't like to be bored.
No.
Well, of course, there's so many things I want to ask you about, but I do want to touch on one more topic because this is just so overlooked in the energy equation. Can you talk about how stress can create abnormal changes in our microbiome and affect our energy?
Yeah, great question. We've got a two-way communication system between our brain and our second brain, which is our gut and its neurons and the microbiome. In fact, the more we've learned about the microbiome, the more we realize that the gut-brain axis actually needs to be renamed the microbiome gut-brain axis. And stress actually works two ways. Stress actually creates leaky gut in and of itself. And I can't tell you the number of people, particularly women, with an autoimmune disease can point to the day their problem started. Either the death of a mother or a divorce or a sudden job loss, like so many of us have had during COVID-19, that actually caused leaky gut. And we actually divert with stress all of our blood flow away from our gut. And you just have to look at the examples of some of these marathon runners who at mile 23 suddenly stop and have bloody diarrhea right in the middle of the race course. And that's because they've diverted all the blood flow away from their gut. And their gut literally becomes ischemic and it falls apart. And stress will do that. But what's even more interesting is that stress actually communicates to the microbiome and changes even good bacteria to leave and bad bacteria to take over. And the more stress you have, the more bad bacteria produce stress hormones that go back up to your brain and reinforce things. So the long and short of it is, the more we give our gut microbiome good things to eat in terms of prebiotics, but more importantly, the more we develop de-stressors, whether it's meditation, whether it's yoga, whether it's just a simple communication system between friends, which has been lost mightily, or what I love to do is have what are called energy snacks. Now, most people think of energy snacks as, oh, I'm going to have an energy bar. What I want people to do is have an exercise snack. And tiny bits of exercise, whether it's walking up and down stairs here in your house for a minute, has amazing de-stressing properties. And as a bonus, it actually makes you not hungry. And so if people will do 10 minutes of energy exercise snacks during the day, they don't have to go out and beat themselves up during exercise. You will, any amount of exercise will begin to repair your gut wall and de-stress you simultaneously.
I love this. That's such a great reframing. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to optimize your health starting today. And also make sure to click below to get a free gift. The question should be like, where the hell does fat go?
Where'd it go?
Does it go to
You just poop it out? Do you sweat it out? Does it?
You got that?
Do I breathe it in?
You've got that Thanos keychain. Does it go to another dimension? You know what I mean? But what they did, and this was so fascinating, they actually tracked the path